what's going on, guys? It's Felix from Podcasting Secrets and the Podcast Promotion Blueprint. So I know you're interested in getting 1,000 podcast listeners, but in the back of your mind, you might be doubting yourself. You might be wondering, is it actually possible? Is it actually possible to get 1,000 podcast listeners, especially when you're just starting, especially when you're brand new, especially when you only have maybe 0 or maybe just 10, maybe it's 100 listeners. It might be hard for you to imagine getting 1,000 podcast listeners. So let's break it down. Let's break down looking at this goal of 1,000 listeners using math. So if you set a goal of just go on one podcast a week for a year, that's 52 weeks in a year, 52 podcast episodes. Now, if each one of those podcast episodes, if you do it right and you get on a podcast that has at least 1,000 listeners, that's 52,000 potential new podcast listeners. And all you do is capture 2% of them. Get 2% of them to check out your podcast and subscribe in order for you to go from 0, no listeners at all, to 1,000 listeners, okay? So if you commit to going on one podcast a week, just an hour of your time, or just 1 hour of your time, once a week, anyone can do it. You have a day job or not. When I was starting my podcast, I was recording episodes, doing guest appearances, all with a day job, and I was still able to get it all done. So it's very possible just to spend 1 hour a week. If you can spend 1 hour a week getting on a bigger podcast with at least 1,000 listeners, and if you do it right using my system, you'll be easily be able to get on podcasts that have at least 1,000 listeners consistently. If you can think of at least 52 podcasts in your niche that you can go on, even if you can't think of them on the top of your head, trust me, any niche out there, you'll be able to find at least 52 of them. You really be able to find hundreds of podcasts you can go on that's relevant to your niche. Go on 52 of them, basically one podcast episode a week on a new podcast with at least 1,000 listeners, right? By the way, that 1,000 number is on the low end because as you grow your podcast, as you get bigger and bigger, you'll be able to get on bigger and bigger podcasts, which makes it even easier and even faster to get to 1,000 listeners. But let's say worst case scenario, one podcast episode a week on a new podcast with at least 1,000 listeners on that podcast. All you gotta do is get 2 out of every 100 people that listen to that podcast to come check out your podcast and subscribe to it. And that's how you get to 1,000 listeners. Just with one podcast a week that you go on for a year, at least 1,000 listeners on that podcast, and within 1 year, you can get to 1,000 podcast listeners on your own podcast. Now, let's go with some more even realistic numbers. As you grow your podcast, you can easily get on podcasts that have 5,000 listeners. If you get on a podcast that has 5,000 listeners and you have 0 listeners right now, all you got to do is get on 10 podcasts. 10 podcasts. And get 2% of those podcast listeners to check out your podcast to 1,000 listeners, okay? 10 podcasts. So literally, if you go on one podcast a week that has 5,000 listeners, within 10 weeks, within 2.5 months, you'll go from 0 to 1,000 listeners. So hopefully that opens your eyes, opens your mind to the possibility of getting to 1,000 listeners. It's just a game. It's just a numbers game. You just got to go on these podcasts using the system that I show you, go on bigger and bigger podcasts, and before you know it, you go from 0 or whatever number you're at to your next 1,000 podcast listeners. Now, if you want to know the exact system to get on the biggest podcasts out there, how to pitch them, how to make sure you do an amazing job so that the audience on those bigger podcasts resonate with you and want to learn more about you, want to follow along with more of your content, want to subscribe to your podcast, and want to be able to leave positive reviews and grow your podcast through word of mouth, all of that is taught inside my Podcast Promotion Blueprint program. And the link to sign up for that, link to check out more of that and enroll is in this post. The doors are closing on this soon. There's a bunch of discounts and bonuses that are included. That is going to go away very, very soon. So if you want to get in and start on this process of going from wherever you're at right now, maybe it's even 0 listeners. Maybe you don't have a podcast yet, or maybe you do have a handful of listeners, but you want to get to 1,000 listeners. Think about the math behind it. It's very possible. Use a system that I've created, the Podcast Promotion Blueprint. It takes you through the entire process to make it as easy as possible, as fast as possible to grow your podcast to 1,000 listeners. The best thing is that once you hit 1,000 listeners, the next 1,000 is even easier. The hardest part is going from 0 to 1,000, which is why I created the program to get you there as fast as possible, a system, a path to get you there as soon as possible. If you're interested in signing for that program, check out the link in this post, and I'll see you inside.